Thank you very much for that really nice introduction. I am so happy to be back in my beloved San Francisco, where I lived many years ago for many really great years, and I'm thrilled to be here. And as Jordan said, I am going to talk about politics, which, as you all know, comes from the Greek word polis, which means many, and ticks, which means blood-sucking insects. And I know that's how many people feel about this election this year. And I just know that so many people are just disgusted with this campaign. And as a matter of fact, I was giving a talk to another group a couple months ago, and I was waiting to come into the auditorium, and a woman sat down next to me, and she said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "Well, I'm speaking to this group." And she said, "Oh, are you an inspirational speaker?" And I said, "No, I'm just the opposite." So I am going to talk about this extraordinary, mind-boggling, unpredictable election. This is certainly the most unusual one I've ever covered in my career. And we do have the two most unpopular candidates in history. Donald Trump has a temperament problem, Hillary Clinton has a character problem, and no, I am not creating a false equivalency between them. But if presidential elections are often described as a choice between who would you rather have a beer with, this one is who would you rather throw a beer at. It's been described as a choice between someone who's unacceptable and someone who's unbelievable. And big numbers of both of their supporters say that they will be casting their vote against the other candidate, not for their candidate. And Donald Trump in particular has crossed so many lines and shattered so many norms that it is a huge challenge for journalists to maintain our even-handed coverage of this election. When Donald Trump stands up and says, "I want to punch a protester in the face," am I supposed to go out and find a pro-punching a protester in the face person to interview and an anti-punching protester in the face person to interview? Then there is the particular challenge for the cable networks and the TV networks, and we saw that on Friday, where they gave 90 minutes of live coverage for his, quote, "a major announcement on birtherism." They showed the empty podium, they showed all the veterans endorsing him, and then Trump came on and said 31 words. 31 words. Yes, he grudgingly said Obama was actually born in the United States, but Hillary started it, and then he left without taking questions. So this is a real challenge. NPR struggles mightily every day to do the best they can, but he has really kind of exploded so many of the norms and boundaries. So where does the race stand now? It's very, very close. It's within the margin of error. And some polls show that Trump is surging in key battleground states, mostly because he's consolidating Republican support, and more importantly, because Hillary Clinton is slipping. She is being hurt in particular by young people who are supporting or at least parking themselves for the moment with the third and fourth party candidates, Gary Johnson and Jill Stein. You know, Gary Johnson, the libertarian candidate who famously was asked the other day about Aleppo, and he said, "What is Aleppo?" And Lindsey Graham, who is one of the funniest members of the United States Senate, tweeted, "He just set back the cause of legalized marijuana by 50 years. But Hillary Clinton is also struggling with other parts of the Obama coalition, which she has to reassemble, not just young people, but Hispanics. A recent Univision poll in Florida showed that even with Donald Trump as the Republican candidate, the most anti-immigrant, anti-Hispanic candidate ever, she is still not getting the support among Hispanics in Florida that Obama got in 2012. He got 60%, she's only at about 53%. So during the summer, she did get a bigger bounce from her convention than he did, and then we had a period where he went through many weeks of self-inflicted wounds, and it seemed as though she had succeeded in making this race a referendum on Donald Trump. Now that is a really neat trick, because elections for a third term, in other words, to follow a two-term president of one party, are always referendums, at least until now, on the incumbent, and she's the incumbent. And it is really, really hard to get a third term to follow a two-term president of your own party. And in the modern era, only George H.W. Bush has managed to pull that off. So it seemed like she was making this a referendum on Donald Trump, she was really accomplishing something quite unusual. She is running against the tide of history. She's running against historic patterns. And of course, we all know that historical rules only work until they stop working, but that's what it seemed like. Now we're not so sure because the race has really tightened. A couple of things happened. She left the campaign trail in August to do a lot of fundraisers. She left a vacuum behind. What filled the vacuum? All those stories about the emails and the foundation. And Donald Trump started showing a little bit more discipline. He started reading from a teleprompter. He started rolling out policies aimed at his weakest demographics, suburban women. He has a child care plan and a family leave plan. And then she got a September surprise, or maybe two of them. First of all, she made the comment about 50% of his supporters being in this basket of deplorables, which actually Democrats are not that worried about. Then she got pneumonia. She got it on Friday, and she didn't tell anyone, and on Sunday she nearly collapsed at the 9/11 memorial service, and that worried Democrats a lot more. First of all, it showed bad judgment. She didn't really confide in her top advisors, and as Maureen Dowd, who I know has spoken to you here before, said, it's not the health, it's the stealth. And this just reinforced one of Hillary Clinton's biggest problems, which is that she's secretive, she seems to have something to hide, and of course we all know that her numbers on honesty and trustworthiness are just terrible. So she took all those debunked conspiracy theories about her health. You know, if you listen to, the kind of the right way, whatever we want to call it, the conspiracy theory industrial complex, they said she'd had a stroke and she has a brain tumor, and they would bring on, there were doctors analyzing videotapes of her to show really she is sick, she doesn't have the stamina, blah, blah, blah. She made all of those legitimate campaign issues. So I get asked a lot, why does Hillary Clinton always hunker down? Why is she in a defensive crouch? Why does she choose opaqueness over transparency? And this is something that a lot of journalists and analysts have really puzzled over. I can only say that even paranoids have enemies. And after 40 years of having enemies, sometimes you get paranoid. And on the pneumonia episode, I actually have some sympathy for her, because women have to be bionic if they are running for president. And you can see why she chose to power through rather than allow all her, what she would call the vast right-wing conspiracy, to say, aha, see, she's weak, she's at home, she can't make it, she doesn't have the stamina. So the irony of this is that this was not the way September was supposed to go for Hillary Clinton. She had made a decision with her campaign to try a different approach. She had started the post-Labor Day period off by holding press conferences. After 270 days without one, all of a sudden she was making herself available to the press on her plane, the people who travel with her. She went on a blog called Humans of New York. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. What better place to humanize yourself than on a blog called Humans of New York? And she told some pretty charming stories about why, as she puts it, why do people think I'm aloof and cold and unemotional? She told stories about how she's dealt with sexism in the past by kind of walling herself off. She also talked about the widely held perception that she kind of yells at you when she gives a speech, and she said, gee, I look out and I see the people in the front row and they seem to be enjoying it pretty much. So she was trying to turn a new leaf. Her campaign understood she needed an affirmative message about herself, not just anti-Donald Trump, and she had planned a series of speeches where she was going to connect her programs to what drives her, kind of try to develop a unifying theme. She has a ton of programs. She has all the lyrics, but she never had the music. She never kind of connected them to a simple, clear, overarching theme or vision. We all know what Donald Trump wants to do. He wants to make America great again. But it was unclear for people to just sum up, what does Hillary Clinton want to do? So the fall for her has really been one step forward, two steps back. And, In addition to her problems with young people and members of the Obama coalition, we also know now from polling that her voters are less enthusiastic about her than his voters are about him. And for a lot of Democrats, this is an election where they have to vote with their heads, not their hearts. And it reminds me of the campaign in Louisiana for governor a number of years ago where David Duke, who of course has become in the news again for his ardent support of Donald Trump, David Duke was running against Edwin Edwards, who was a famously corrupt politician in Louisiana, and I guess he had a lot of company. But there were two great bumper stickers. One is, vote for the lizard, not the wizard, because David Duke was in the KKK. And the other one, which is more relevant today, vote for the crook, it's important. So anyway, what we do know about Donald Trump supporters is they don't care if he insults a Gold Star family or asks the Russians to hack into Hillary Clinton's emails or says nice things about Vladimir Putin. His supporters are very loyal. They feel he tells it like it is. He's not politically correct. He kind of sticks it to the elites. When I've covered Trump rallies, one of the most common comments I've heard from his supporters is, he says what I'm thinking. No one else says what I'm thinking. And some of his supporters, as Hillary Clinton said in her basket of deplorables remarks, some of his supporters are responding to kind of racialist, xenophobic, Islamophobic rhetoric, but other of his supporters are just so fed up with the system that they are willing to vote for someone they think is unqualified to be president. 70% of voters say that Donald Trump either doesn't have the temperament or the qualifications or the judgment to be president. But clearly, many of them are voting for him because he's polling way above those internals. And some of them feel they're reflexive Republicans. They feel that hanging on to the Supreme Court is more important than anything else. They feel that Hillary Clinton would be much worse, or they just think the system needs to be blown up, even at the expense of voting for a candidate that large numbers of voters tell pollsters they feel is risky. He also has a powerful message on the economy and trade and terrorism. He says, I'm going to fix all these problems. I can't remember which poll this was, but there was a blind test done of the themes in both of their convention speeches. They took his kind of moment of crisis, midnight in America, really kind of apocalyptic vision, and the terrorists are threatening our way of life, and they put that up against her message, don't let anyone tell you that America is weak. But they didn't attach their names to it. They just blind tested the message, and his won by quite a big margin. So he may be a very flawed messenger, but he does have a powerful message, especially to voters who are fearful and anxious. And here is the big, big question of 2016. Okay, so if she has all of these advantages, President Obama is at 50% or above approval rating. That is usually the biggest political indicator of an election, is the approval rating of the sitting president for the person of their own party running. The economy is getting better. We know now that even middle-class incomes are starting to rise after a long time of being stagnant. We know she has more money. She's advertised more on television. She has field operation, whereas he's relying on big rallies and tweets, pretty much. She also has the endorsements of lots of prominent Republicans. She's got a unified party. She has a tremendous number of powerful surrogates, starting with President Obama, Michelle Obama, Bill Clinton. He's a one-man band. He has a divided party. So why, if she has all those advantages, why is this race so close? So there are a lot of reasons, and some of it is just that she is a weak candidate. She has terrible unfavorable ratings. She's considered not likable. She has, as I said, no big overarching theme or message. If he is so spontaneous and unscripted that sometimes he seems out of control, she is so scripted that even when she's being spontaneous, she can seem robotic and consulted. So still, this is a binary choice, and I don't know which politician first said this, but both of these candidates are telling their supporters, please compare me to the alternative, not to the almighty. And both candidates are counting on that. So the next big event, a week from tomorrow, is the first debate. That is going to be really one of the only chances, and the other two debates, that either candidate will have before an audience of perhaps over 100 million people to change the dynamic of the race. And debates, especially ones that Donald Trump participates in, are very unpredictable. Martin O'Malley, who of course ran for president against Hillary Clinton, compared Donald Trump in a debate to a monkey with a machine gun. And Steve Schmidt, who's a Republican operative and lives here in California, said that having Donald Trump in a debate is kind of like going to a NASCAR race where one of the drivers is drunk. You just don't know what is going to happen. So yes, she is a much more experienced debater, but she has a higher hurdle to clear. He, as President Obama has complained, he's graded on a curve. There is a double standard. Her expectations are real. The expectations for her in the debate are very high. Her supporters complain that the bar for him is set way too low. They say if he doesn't insult her 10 times in the first 30 seconds, he's going to be considered presidential. And some of this double standard is gendered and unfair. Some of it is understandable. She's been in public service for 40 years. He's been a businessman, and she is judged by a different standard. He has a lower bar. He just has to convince enough people that he is a plausible president. She has to prove that she's not unlikable, dishonest, and untrustworthy. So, and which is amazing, since he lies repeatedly with impunity. And as a reality TV celebrity, he has considered lying, or what he said in his book, quote, truthful hyperbole, part of building his brand. And the other thing to remember about the debates is debates are a character test. They are not a policy contest. They are about demeanor. And he speaks in very simple, clear sentences, and he simply has a bigger margin for error than she does. So that just goes under the life is unfair department. But the debates will be very consequential. They generally don't determine the outcome of a race. We can think of so many times where one candidate or the other, quote, lost the debate and went on to win, or won the debate and went on to lose. But in this case, because the race is so close, and because so many people are going to be watching, and both of these candidates have such high negatives, I think these debates will be really, really important. So I want to step back a little bit and talk about why. Why are we having an election like this? We certainly had an explosion of populism, angry populism really, this year on both sides of both parties. Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders didn't just come from nowhere. And Trump in particular did a mind meld with a certain segment of the electorate, particularly Republican voters, Republican primary voters, and this year voters are really angry and anxious. Who are they angry at? Well, Trump voters are angry at politicians, elites, the media, immigrants, trade deals. They're angry at President Obama, but they are especially angry at their own Republican leadership in Washington, who promised them over and over again, if they just gave Republicans control of the House and Senate, they would stop the Obama agenda in its tracks. And that did not happen. Democrats are angry too, but not as angry as Republicans. Democrats are angry at Wall Street and at Bernie Sanders' billionaires and at an economic system that seems rigged and a political system that seems rigged against ordinary people. And there are actually good reasons for voters to feel this way. The first one, stagnating middle-class incomes. 81% of Americans' incomes are flat or declining for a decade. And we've had slow growth, 3% for over 2 years, for over 10 straight years. And even though we know unemployment is down, middle-class incomes, we have just learned, are growing at a faster rate than they have in a very long time. They're almost back to where they were in 2007, but people just don't feel that. Second reason is terrorism. After Orlando and San Bernardino, people feel that terrorism has come to our shores. They look abroad and they see the world is on fire, and they see that the world's only superpower is powerless to do anything about it except for get involved in endless feudal wars. And the third reason for voters' anxiety, or at least some voters, is changing demographics. We've had the first majority-minority kindergarten class, and for many voters, particularly white working-class men, they feel not only are their jobs disappearing, but their place in society is threatened too. Now, globalization and deindustrialization are not new. They've been going on for a very long time. But they really seem to have come to a head this year all over the world, with Brexit, with all the anti-immigrant parties gaining steam in Europe and elsewhere. So when you take those three trends and you wrap them all together into one big stew, and Donald Trump is a very great chef at doing this, it's a real recipe for volatility, and it predated Trump. Since 2000, every election except for 2012 has been a change election, and by that I mean either the White House or one house or both houses of Congress have changed party control, except for 2012, which was a status quo election. So voters keep on voting for change, but they can't seem to get the change they want. And there's a reason for that, and it makes them even angrier, which is gridlock in Washington. We have all these huge problems, and Washington can't seem to get together. The two parties in Washington can't seem to get together to fix them. People ask me all the time, why can't they get anything done? Why can't they do something about infrastructure or education or the tax system or entitlements, make some reforms that actually might boost productivity and growth? You know, a lot of the gridlock comes from polarization, which is the most important dynamic, I think, in politics today. It's baked into the cake, although I think a lot of it could be overcome with political will and leadership. But just to give you an example about how polarized and divided our government is, currently there is not a single Democrat in the United States Senate with a more conservative voting record than any Republican. Now, you might say, well, duh, of course not. But actually, in the past, there were many Republicans who were liberal or moderate and many Democrats who were conservative or moderate. And together, the overlap between those two groups formed the center of the political spectrum. And that's where compromises were made and deals got done. And now there's just a black abyss between the two parties. Red state Democrats losing their seats, blue state Republicans are going extinct. The same thing is true in the House of Representatives, where the vast majority of members win their elections with 55% of the vote or more. If you're a Republican, you only have to worry about a primary challenge from your Tea Party right. If you're a Democrat, you generally only have to worry about a primary challenge from your left. So Democrats and Republicans increasingly live in separate political universes. And some of this is gerrymandering, the way the district lines are drawn to benefit incumbents. Just to give you an example of that, in 2012, if you took the national vote for the House of Representatives, all the Democratic House candidates, and then compared them to all the Republican House candidates, the Democratic House candidates altogether got 1.4 million more votes than all the Republican House candidates combined. But the Republicans held on to their 34-seat majority in the House. Now that is a neat trick. And it's not just because of these artificial congressional district lines. The population has sorted itself out also. Republicans and Democratic voters increasingly live in separate political universes. People tend to live near other people who think like them. They listen to media that agrees with them. This is why journalists, who generally, national journalists, tend to live in the Acela corridor. That's why we all miss the Trump phenomenon. I'm asked all the time, how come nobody knew that he would go this far? It was a failure of imagination on our part and also on the part of the Republican establishment. So the media itself is polarized. Fox and MSNBC don't even cover the same natural disasters anymore. I'm the exception that proves the rule on that, because I do appear on Fox. And a recent poll that Pew took showed that 49% of Republicans and 33% of Democrats said that they would be very unhappy if a child of theirs married someone from the opposite party. So there you have it. You know, we've met the enemy and they are us. The other huge story of the 2016 campaign is what is happening to the Republican Party. We have never in our lifetimes witnessed what might be the crack-up of a major American political party, or at least the utter transformation of one. Now, is that what Trump is doing to the GOP? We don't quite know yet, but we know that this marriage between a corporate-backed Republican establishment and a white working-class base is on the rocks. And over time, the Republican primary electorate was changing. It was getting more downwardly mobile, more non-college educated white voters. And for decades, Republicans successfully courted these voters with social issues: guns, crime, abortion, school prayer, gay marriage, distrust of elites and governments. And they always had a message for these voters, but they never had an economic program for them. So when globalization and wage stagnation became reached a kind of tipping point, along comes Donald Trump, who speaks to their humiliation. You know, one of the things he says at his rallies all the time is, we'll never be taken advantage of again. You know, we're going to start winning again. He's kind of the id of the GOP. And the Republican establishment really misunderstood their own base. That's one of the biggest stories this year. They thought that their base were ideological conservatives. Nope. They weren't ideological at all. They didn't care about free markets and small government and a strong American presence abroad. They just felt they were being screwed. And they wanted someone to speak for them. And Donald Trump, they feel, speaks for them in a way that the Republican establishment didn't. And don't forget, Donald Trump is not a conservative or even a traditional Republican. He's a populist. He's more in the tradition of Huey Long and George Wallace and Ross Perot. And he's also right in a kind of populist tradition in the Republican Party recently. You could draw a straight line from Pat Buchanan to Sarah Palin and then to the Tea Party. So American populism has always combined nativism and economic grievance. Grievance against resentment against those at the bottom, immigrants, minorities, and those at the top, Wall Street and big business and elites. And populism always tells a clear, simple story with a clearly identified villain, whether it's trade deals or billionaires or immigrants or big banks. Populism is just something that is easy to communicate. Now, there is an antidote to this, and it's called more economic growth broadly shared. A big, growing middle class is the secret sauce that keeps democratic capitalist societies alive and healthy. Now, I know that's easier said than done, but that's where we've really fallen down on the job. The big question, I think, for Republicans is Trump just an attitude? Is he just a vehicle for anger at the establishment? Or is he altering the DNA of the Republican Party in a permanent way? Don't forget that Donald Trump won more votes in the Republican primary than any candidate had ever before. He beat what Republican Party officials considered to be the strongest field of candidates that they had ever had running for president, 16 candidates. Donald Trump is like a wrecking ball, laying waste to one bedrock principle of republicanism and conservatism after another. Free trade, small government. He doesn't want Medicare and Social Security touched at all. Entitlement reform, forget about it. NATO, he's willing to upend 70 years of a foreign policy consensus and rethink our commitment to NATO. He doesn't even like American exceptionalism. His biggest split with the Republican establishment is on immigration, which is the centerpiece of his campaign. And you know, after 2012, when Mitt Romney lost the Hispanic vote, 71 to 27%, the RNC commissioned a report that came to be called the autopsy report. I always say after one party loses, they always commission, they set up a commission. I always call it the What Just Happened to Us Commission. And they write a report to find out what they can do better. And this report had a lot of technical recommendations about debates and primary schedules, but it made one and only one policy recommendation. And that was, they said that the party should embrace comprehensive immigration reform, because if they didn't, they would never be able to speak to the fastest growing portion of the electorate, which are Hispanic voters. So that was in March of 2013. Let's fast forward 3 years. Trump and the base of the party said, forget it. Hell no, we're going in the opposite direction. You know, the Republican establishment's idea was, let's change the box, but not the pizza. In other words, let's get Marco Rubio or somebody like him, young, Hispanic, he's modern, he can communicate to voters beyond our base, but we'll sell the same conservative principles, the same program, but we'll have a better package and a better messenger. Trump said, nope, let's change the pizza. So Trump himself might be a black swan event. I don't think that we're going to see another billionaire reality TV celebrity anytime soon. He really is unique in the way he's been able to completely dominate the media, social media, with his tweets and what we call free media, otherwise known as news coverage. I don't think that will happen again anytime soon, but don't kid yourself. There is a real market for Trumpism, and aspiring Republican presidential candidates are watching really closely, thinking about 2020 and taking note of all of this, and thinking how they can take, you know, the parts of Trumpism that work for the base, maybe without some of the rough edges. So the big question is, will the Republican Party turn into a white working class party, a kind of nativist, nationalist, isolationist xenophobic party like you see in Europe? We don't know. Or maybe the next Republican candidate, maybe Trump will be running for re-election. Then he'll really remake the party in his own image if he wins. But if he doesn't, the next Republican candidate, maybe, would be a Trumpist without the racist rhetoric. So they could somehow appeal to college-educated voters, white suburban women. So basically, what a lot of Republicans are talking about now, is there such a thing as Trumpism without the white identity politics, the kind of identity politics that Paul Ryan has complained about over and over again. And Paul Ryan, who of course has really performed, he's the Speaker of the House, nobody knows that, he's performed this incredible balancing act, which gets very uncomfortable at times because he doesn't want to break with Donald Trump because he knows that a divided party tends to not win elections. But he doesn't want to associate himself with a lot of what Trump says, and he is regularly having to come out and say, no, I disagree with him. And as my colleague E.J. Dionne said, being for Donald Trump means always having to say you're sorry. So that's going to be the next big, brutal fight inside the Republican Party about its future. So now to a closer term future. Let's just talk about the election again and the map, because that's what all political junkies are doing every day, is going to those red and blue maps to see what it looks like. As I'm sure you all know, we don't elect our presidents by popular referendum. We elect them by the Electoral College. And Democrats have a structural advantage in the Electoral College. And for the last 6 elections, in every one of those 6 elections, Democrats have won 18 states and Washington, D.C., for a total of 242 electoral votes, and you only need 270 to win, so that's a pretty good base. Republicans, in every one of the last 6 elections, have won 13 states equaling 103 electoral votes. So they really are behind the 8 ball, and the reason why Democrats have a structural advantage is because of demographics. They have an advantage in presidential elections in what we call the rising American electorate, RAE. These are the parts of the electorate that are growing. Young people, minorities, single women, and those demographics are growing. The Republican base, whiter, more rural, more married, more church-going, less college-educated, those are the parts of the electorate that are shrinking. So, and that's also, then there's the other great irony of American politics, which is the rising American electorate only turns out every 4 years for some incredible reason, which we can talk about later. There are reasons for it, but Democrats just can't get their voters out every 2 years for some reason. Republicans turn their voters out every 2 years. And because Democrats have failed spectacularly in 2010 and 2014 in the midterm elections at getting their voters out, you now have nationally fewer Democratic elected officials, and I'm talking about from dog catcher all the way up to right below the White House, than at any time since the 1920s. So below the White House, the Republicans are the majority party. So Trump's theory was, I'm going to turn out so many more white working class voters that I will flip blue states red, states like Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin. He hasn't done that yet, but right now when you look at that map, she could lose Florida, Ohio, Nevada, North Carolina, and Iowa and still win the election. He could win all of those states. He has a very narrow path. She has a lot of paths to the White House. But if he got all of those states, he would need one more, say it's New Hampshire. If he got New Hampshire plus all those states I just listed, the Electoral College, the vote would be 269 to 269, and it would go to the House of Representatives, and he would become the president. So this tells you maybe the race is going to come down to New Hampshire, which is incredible. So, as I said, she's had a lot of problems reassembling the Obama coalition, but Donald Trump needs to do better with white college-educated voters. This is a demographic that no Republican has lost since 1952, and right now she's ahead of him by about 17 points with white college-educated voters. Now, he's winning white non-college by 2 to 1, but that's not enough. So the other kind of irony for him is that the more he uses raw appeals to white identity politics, the more he risks turning off suburban women, independents, and white college-educated voters, despite all of the policies that he might roll out for them. So white working class voters are, as I said, a shrinking part of the electorate, but also they're about a third of the national electorate now. They used to be 20 years ago, they were half. They're still about a third in some of these Rust Belt states like Ohio and Pennsylvania. But they're shrinking by 3 points every single presidential election. But they also have a history of not turning out to vote. The turnout rate for white non-college is 57%, and the turnout rate for college-educated voters is about 80%. So, very hard to make predictions, especially about the future. But I will safely say that I feel very confident saying that whoever is president on January 20th will have the highest disapproval rating of any president coming into that office. Now, if the election were held today, yes, she would win very narrowly. But I just want to say, before we go to Q&A, about this election, which has been so disorienting and just basically indescribable. I think it has really shown me how fragile our democracy is. And our democracy is only as strong as our faith in it and our willingness to abide by certain unwritten rules and norms of civil discourse. You know, you've got a candidate who has said that if the only way he can lose the election is if it's stolen from him. He's already saying that we shouldn't have faith in our electoral process. He says the system is rigged. I don't know exactly what he's going to tell his supporters to do if he loses. He's also made these casual threats of violence. Just yesterday he said, you know, we should take away Hillary Clinton's bodyguards because, you know, she believes in gun control. We should disarm her bodyguards, and then he said we should see what happens to her. So, you know, it's not so much when he has mocked a disabled reporter or said things about minorities and women, he sometimes says, oh, I was just kidding. It's not just what you say, it's what people hear. Then you've got the Russians, who we are told have the capacity to at least hack into some of our ballot systems, and whether or not they do that or succeed, they've already succeeded in undermining our confidence in the secrecy and privacy of the ballot. So I would like to end my remarks with something really uplifting about the election. So I will try, which is that it's really, really, really important to vote. And anyone who doesn't vote or thinks that their vote doesn't count basically cedes their right to complain about anything that happens afterwards. So I'm happy to answer any of your questions.
We have microphones on both sides. The first question's in the front.
It's very hard for me to understand how the impoverished or poor working class population can believe Trump will help them not be poor when they see how he lives, that he reveals nothing about his tax records or whatever leaks out. It belies enormous denial or ignorance. It's just hard to believe that this man is not an elitist and will not make policy that will benefit the taxes and the life of the elite.
Well, I can't really explain that either. I can just say to you that it's true that if you look at the analysis of his tax plans, they do benefit the wealthy. But he says every day, I'm going to fix this. Just trust me. I alone can bring back all those manufacturing jobs that, by the way, left in 1980. You know, and I can fix this. I can turn this around. I'm going to get rid of these trade deals. And you know, when you're really hurting, that sounds pretty good. Plus, don't forget, he is a very well-known person. He has been on television for a very long time. And people are used to watching him on Celebrity Apprentice. They like the lifestyle, you know, looks pretty good. I can't really explain this. There have been books and books written on why do people vote against their, quote, economic interests. Sometimes it's cultural. There are a lot of reasons why people vote, but that's what's happening.
Another question down in front.
Yes, I'd like to ask you what your understanding and what you think the chances of the Democrats regaining the Senate. Talk about the senatorial elections and what places the Democrats have the best chance.
Okay. If Hillary Clinton wins, the Democrats need 4 seats to get a majority. If she loses, they need 5. So generally, Senate races in a presidential year tend to follow the presidential vote. But this year is really unusual because so many Senate candidates, Republicans, have tried to separate themselves from Donald Trump. Many of them are polling ahead of him in their states. And maybe he's so unusual and so un-Republican-like in many ways that he is seen as something different. We do know that ticket-splitting voting has been declining. Even though more and more voters say they're independents, fewer and fewer voters actually split their ticket. In other words, vote for Hillary Clinton for president, but then a Republican for Senate. Of course, that's what Republicans are counting on this year. So I would say that when you look at the map, there are many more Republicans up for election this year than Democrats. So this is a good year for Democrats to get back the majority. I think that the first 2 that are likely to flip is Wisconsin and Illinois, then Pennsylvania and New Hampshire, depending on what happens in New Hampshire. That's 4 right there. Beyond that, what we've seen is that partially because the big Republican donors who are not giving to Donald Trump have been pouring their money into the Senate races because that's their top priority, you've seen a lot of Republican incumbents who are facing pretty tough races, like in places like Missouri and North Carolina and even John McCain in Arizona. I mean, that's unusual that they're doing pretty good. Florida, since Marco Rubio decided, after all, he didn't hate the Senate as much as he thought he did, and decided after he said he wouldn't run again, he decided to run again. He's probably going to win re-election, and so that is something that Democrats won't be able to get. And in Ohio, which is an amazing place, where you have Ohio, where Donald Trump is running ahead pretty consistently by a couple points. John Kasich is one of the most anti-Trump Republican governors out there. He hasn't lent Trump his machine, which I understand is formidable. So Rob Portman, the sitting senator, is running way ahead of Ted Strickland, the former governor. Now, granted, Strickland has turned out to be a pretty bad candidate, but Rob Portman is the former U.S. trade representative for George W. Bush. He encapsulates everything that Donald Trump is against in a Rust Belt state, and he's doing pretty good. So it shows you that, yes, you can kind of run against the top of your ticket or at least separate yourself and still win. So I think the chances for, right now, the chances for Democrats getting the 4 seats they need are pretty good, but, that would give them just a 1-seat majority with Tim Kaine as the vice president breaking, having to sit there all the time. So, but that's what I think is the outlook right now.
The next question is here.
Thank you. This has been very much about the election in this moment in time, and I want you to perhaps prognosticate a little bit about governance, because I'm very mindful that on January 21st, what happens when
that's
it's either
a really good question.
Yeah.
What would it look? What would governance look like under a Trump or a Clinton? Okay. Well, we think if Hillary Clinton is the president, she will be devoted in a way that President Obama chose not to be, in finding, really working with Republicans, finding areas of compromise and bipartisan consensus. Her 2 biggest initiatives are immigration reform and infrastructure. Infrastructure is something that has bipartisan support. Certainly the business community wants that, which is another really interesting story of this year, how the business community has in some ways supported her. She's gotten a lot of money from Wall Street, but also kind of been repelled by him. He picked fights with the Chamber of Commerce, which is one of the most bedrock pieces of the Republican coalition. But anyway, so she, I think, would do that. I think she would start with immigration and infrastructure. And then the big question is what do Republicans decide to do? There still will be a Republican House, we're pretty sure. Maybe Paul Ryan will have a smaller majority. We don't know about the Senate. It's possible that the Republicans could keep the Senate and she could be the president. That would be historically unprecedented for a Democrat to win the White House and not bring a House of Congress with them. But the big question is, Republicans have decided over the past, 10, 15 years, the best way to be in the minority is to oppose everything that the White House wants to do, because that's the best path to getting the majority again. And it's worked pretty well for them. But they'll have to decide what lessons if they lose, what are the lessons that they learn? It depends on the size of the loss. after 2012, a lot of Republicans said, we have to pass immigration reform. We have to get this issue off the table because then we can appeal to Hispanic voters on our issues, conservative social issues, fiscal responsibility, things that they thought that Hispanic voters would like. Well, they ran into a buzzsaw called the Republican base who didn't want that. So a lot of this will depend on what the Republicans in Congress decide to do. If Trump is the president, I mean, I have a failure of imagination on that one because I don't know. I don't even know if he knows. Will he just cede the agenda to Republicans in Congress? I mean, he wants to build a wall and get Mexico to pay for it. We know that. He wants to renegotiate trade deals. We know that. But how's he going to do that? A lot of these things have to be passed by Congress. Now, don't kid yourself. The president has tremendous powers of things he can do on his own. You saw Barack Obama, when he was stymied by Congress, he did a lot of things by executive order. They're not permanent, but he can do them. So we don't know exactly what he would do. I don't know if he quite knows either. But one of the best stories that I ever read this year, and it's one of those stories that are too good to check. I think it was in the Washington Post, and the story was that the reporter had talked to, I think it was the chief of staff for John Kasich, and this was before the convention, and he had been approached by Donald Trump Jr., who said, would you like to be on the ticket as the vice president? And he said, you'll have a very big portfolio. And Kasich's guy said, well, what would that be? He said, well, you'll be in charge of policy. And he said, what kind of policy? He said, foreign and domestic. And the Kasich guy says, well, what will President Trump be doing? And Don Trump Jr. says, he'll be making America great again. So, I mean, who knows? Maybe Mike Pence will be running the government. I don't know. But Trump has said that he sees his role. He's going to be a cheerleader for America. He feels that hasn't been done. And anyway, but on that one, I'm as mystified as anybody else.
Question down in the center here.
Oh, thank you. I like Hillary. I like her. I like Hillary.
Okay, good.
Her.
Yeah, okay.
I feel like she's friendly. I feel like she's honest. I don't distrust her for vague reasons, and I don't entirely understand why you keep hearing that over and over by people in the media. Now, I understand that you're
the polls
responding.
show that. We aren't saying that. We're not making that up. We're looking at
No, but to what extent do you think that the media does say over and over again what the polls are kind of, how much does the media influence what people are thinking that way?
Well, this is a hard question to answer. First of all, there is no such thing as the media. We're not a big monolithic thing. We don't get together every morning and decide what we are going to do. But it's just, this is, as I said, even paranoids have enemies, and 40 years of public service will get you a lot of enemies. And she, has been in the public eye for a long time. She has a certain personality. She does value her privacy, and she can appear to be not forthcoming. She has often tried to not disclose information only to end up having to disclose it in the end. The email server is kind of a classic example, and that creates this image among many voters, not all, that she's secretive, untrustworthy, she's hiding something. Plus, she's got this huge kind of, army of detractors and opponents, partisan opponents, who've been telling people that. So for whatever reason, right now, pardon? But we can't not report. We're not, we can't, it's hard to describe this. We cannot control what people think, and we also don't manufacture what they think. We try, as best as we can, to fairly cover people in the public eye, and then we also talk to voters and find out what they're thinking. I think there's plenty of blame to go around, and the media will do lots of soul searching after this election. I can guarantee you that's actually happening right now. I mean, after the event on Friday, actually this is very, very small, but the TV networks refused to send their cameras to follow him on a tour of his new hotel because he wouldn't let a producer go. In other words, after he gave that press conference that wasn't a press conference about birtherism, he invited the press to come and take a tour of the hotel. That's where his new hotel on Pennsylvania Avenue, that's where the event was. But he said, but no, I don't want any producers or reporters, because he didn't want anyone shouting a question at him, because he didn't want to answer any questions. So the press pool, because that's how they operate when there's not enough room for everyone, they send a small group of cameras with one pooled reporter or producer. They said, sorry, we're not going to do it. So that's an example of the press decide. Now, it's very small, because the other alternative, people ask me all the time, why does the press cover him? Why do the cable nets cover him live? Okay, some of them could decide not to. Then they'd lose their audience ratings, because the other networks would. So this is a collective action problem. Isn't that what they call it in game theory? And that was the problem during the Republican primaries. All of those other candidates, if they'd all dropped out and just unified behind one Trump alternative, they probably could have defeated him. But none of them wanted to drop out, so they didn't. And he ran against a fractured field. And, another example of this, the media, the television talk shows and Sunday talk shows used to have a rule that candidates had to come on set to be interviewed, because then you could see them and you could see their facial expressions. But because Donald Trump was so good for ratings, they got rid of that rule and they let him call in. So he could, that's one way he dominated the media. He could be on 5, 6, 7 talk shows in a day, with the exception of Chris Wallace on Fox News, who never let Donald Trump call in and hasn't to this day. So.
The next question is here.
Do the third and fourth party candidates matter to the outcome in the swing states?
Yes, they do. Usually they don't, but I would say this year they do, because first of all, so many young people are parking themselves with Johnson and Stein. We saw what happened in 2000 with Ralph Nader in Florida. He certainly mattered. Yeah, I think this year they could matter. Now, historically, they fade at the end. Right now, combined, I think they're getting about 12 to 14%, and they tend to fade at the end. But maybe they won't, because like I said, the historical rules only work till they stop working. And this year has blown up so many of them, we're not quite sure. But yes, it matters. And I think you're going to hear from the Clinton campaign a big message, and everybody's going to be delivering it, Obama and Michelle and Joe Biden, that a vote for Gary Johnson or Jill Stein is a vote for Donald Trump. And I think that's something they're really worried about.
The next question is in the middle.
Oh, you're holding it. Okay. So thank you very much for your wonderful presentation.
Thanks.
I was wondering if Bernie Sanders could get out and address his young people support. Could he? We haven't heard very much from him. Would that make a difference?
He has been actually out there saying that. But Bernie Sanders, we learned at the Democratic Convention, he doesn't control his supporters, and they didn't listen to him in the convention when he asked them to stop booing on the floor. They didn't do that, or please don't walk out. He said, do it as a personal favor to me, and they just, didn't. So Bernie, I think Bernie's important. He is out there giving that message. I mean, he has been campaigning for her, but also for certain congressional candidates that he feels are aligned with his views. So he has been out there. But I don't think that he has the ability to just kind of sway huge numbers of young people to Hillary Clinton, even as much as he might try. I think he lost that ability to do that. I think for a lot of reasons. I mean, we could have a whole discussion about Sanders and what he told his supporters and how much of it was realistic. And
Question up here on the right.
I'd like to return for a moment to the question of the role of the media in this election. I know that a lot of people think that the media will bear some responsibility if Donald Trump wins in their quest to be even-handed in coverage, and that the media has sort of abdicated its role as the truth police, which I believe Chris Wallace said explicitly that he was not. Can you talk a little bit about the role that you think the media has played in elevating Trump? I know you talked about the ratings race, but also in the future of this idea of lending credence to both sides, even when one is factually wrong.
Well, I would say if you read any print coverage, the headlines now, at least in the national newspapers, Donald Trump lies about this. Donald Trump said today, which is not true. Donald Trump, Donald Trump completely overwhelmed the fact-checking departments of every newspaper and TV. And we're no longer fact-checking in a separate article. That's what we used to do. You'd let the candidate have their say, and then you'd run a fact-check and explain whether they were truthful or not. We're not doing that anymore. It's right there in the story. And the TV nets, at least CNN, are running the chyrons, the text at the bottom of the screen that says, today Donald Trump said this, which is not true. I mean, that is happening. Now, the thing about what Chris Wallace said about his role as a debate moderator is that it's not his job to sit there and argue with Donald Trump about whether something's true or not. That's the job of Hillary Clinton, who's going to speak in 30 seconds, But the thing about Trump, and we've never seen a candidate like him, like I said, I don't know if we ever will again, but just that he completely blusters through. In his book, Art of the Deal, he talked about truthful hyperbole as being an important tool. This has been a huge challenge for the media. I don't have really easy answers for you. I think that his falsehoods, inaccuracies, whatever you want to call them, lies, have been pointed out by the media over and over again. And we now have a huge discussion of false equivalency and whether they're held to two different standards and whether that's fair. That's a discussion in the media. I think that for there, like I said, when the postmortems of this election are written, and my God, there are going to be a ton of them, there are going to be a lot of people that will come in for, quote, blame. But all I can say is you only get to blame any of us if you vote.
The next question is up here.
I'd like to ask you a question that alludes to the book Dark Money. To what extent, or could you discuss the nastiness and the polarization of the current election in the context of the Koch's activities over the last 10 and 20 years?
Well, there's no doubt that big, unlimited, anonymous money has been, a big force certainly since Citizens United. What's really interesting about the Kochs is they are not for Donald Trump. And they've been pouring their money into down ballot races, and they've been focusing on the long game of trying to create a real constituency for their, free market, small government views, which of course are completely anathema to Donald Trump. But, and this is a race where big money isn't playing as much of a role as it could have been. Don't kid yourself, there are super PACs, and Hillary Clinton has one, it's very well funded. Donald Trump has a couple that are not as well funded as Hillary's. But Trump would say that he has almost reinvented how you run a presidential campaign. This is a pretty good beta test of two completely different approaches. You've got one campaign, Hillary Clinton's, who is using the most sophisticated data, analytics, targeting, the best outreach program that money can buy. Now, granted, she's running up against a big problem because without organic enthusiasm for the candidate, it doesn't matter if you have a great field operation. But Donald Trump says, I don't need all that. He's even said that all this stuff is vastly overrated because he dominates the media. He can tweet, and by the way, tweeting is an unfiltered media. In other words, he can reach his supporters without going through any of us. And as gatekeepers, the media has been kind of dissolving for decades. Bill Clinton, remember, went on Arsenio Hall and, and said, this is great, I don't have to go through the press corps. But anyway, but the thing about dark money, it is a huge factor. It's played a kind of unusual role in this race because it hasn't been as big. Usually you'd think the Republicans would have the great advantage of super PAC money. But we do know that Hillary Clinton has promised to appoint Supreme Court justices that would overturn Citizens United. Donald Trump, on the other hand, hired David Bossie, who was Citizens United, to be his deputy campaign manager.
There's a question down here in the center.
Do you think either party will restructure their nomination process to ensure that a member of their party gets nominated?
That's a really, really good question. Well, Donald Trump is a member of the Republican Party. If you're talking about Bernie, that's a really good question because One of the things that Sanders wanted, of course, was a say in how the Democratic rules will be rewritten. Of course, he wants it to be that anybody could vote in a Democratic primary even if they're not registered as a Democrat. So that's going to be a big fight inside the party. The Republican Party hasn't had that problem. I mean, Donald Trump was a Republican. Maybe the Republican Party will decide to have superdelegates after this because they didn't have them. They didn't have a kind of institutional establishment thumb on the scale the way that the Democrats do.
The next question is in the back.
I have a question. I'm very concerned about the Supreme Court. The candidate that we have now that Obama has put forth, what happens?
Okay.
What happens?
To Merrick Garland's. Yeah, okay. Merrick Garland, well, first of all, we don't know if Hillary Clinton will renominate him if she's the president. I think the chances are pretty good that she would. Then there's the question of what happens in the lame duck. Mitch McConnell has said that he doesn't believe that any nomination should be voted on until the next president and the next Congress takes office in January. He thinks that's unfair to do that. But there are Republicans who have said, gee, Merrick Garland is a lot more middle of the road, moderate guy than we're likely to get from Hillary Clinton, so maybe he's the best we can do. We should just accept him in a lame duck session. I don't know what's going to happen. But I think that, it's very possible that even if they don't take it up in the lame duck, that Hillary Clinton would just renominate him in January. And that certainly would be her easiest path to getting the ninth justice seated, because he is broadly acceptable. As a matter of fact, right before he was nominated, Orrin Hatch famously said, well, gee, if Barack Obama nominated someone like Merrick Garland, he could get someone on the court, but he's not. He's too liberal to do that. And then he turned around and nominated him, so that was pretty funny.
Question up in the center.
What is your analysis of Donald Trump? Do you think this is all a big play in order to get elected, or do you think he's actually really narcissistic, maybe even certifiable? And do you also think that he would go so far to create something like the Third Reich?
Well, first of all, you mean this is all an act to get elected? No, I believe this is what he's like. No, I don't think he decided that being this outrageous is a really great way to become president. No, I think this is him. This is who he is. No, I don't think he'll create the Third Reich.
Question up here on the right.
I understand from just watching television, listening to the radio, that Gary Johnson has support, both from Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, because they're like Republicans who can't stand the idea of voting for Trump. So I understand that he's going to be a factor in a way that Nader was a factor. And I look at that man as a total turncoat to us. But how much an effect will Jill Stein have on any of this, or will it probably be so negligible that she's not the issue that Johnson is?
Yes, I agree with you. She's pulling at 3% right now, so I think she's not much of an issue. Now Gary Johnson, who we all thought would pull from Donald Trump because he's a libertarian, and he would give maybe a place for libertarians or for Republicans to park themselves, actually right now is hurting Hillary Clinton more because he's bringing in he's taking so many young people who don't want to vote for her and are either looking for a place to park themselves or just, won't vote for her. So right now he's hurting her. Up until now it's been kind of mixed. He hasn't seemed to have an effect on either candidate, but I would say the latest polls show that he is hurting her.
The next question is on your left.
Do you have any insights, or have you heard any explanations about why Hillary botched her explanation of her email situation for so long?
I mean, oh man, this is just, I don't have a great explanation. It is kind of mind-boggling. There are all these questions. Why did she do it in the first place? Who advised her she could do it? There's always a question of who's advising her, who's she listening to? this is a pattern with all of the Clinton so-called scandals. A lot of smoke, no fire. A lot of mishegas, can't really explain it, stonewalls, then explains it, and then it turns out the explanation isn't quite accurate. And then when you finally see the emails, like there's not that much in them. There's no smoking gun. Now, there are a lot of them that were deleted, but if she'd carried 2 devices, one for personal and one for State Department, she was completely allowed to delete all the personal ones. It was up to her to go through them and decide what to turn over to the State Department. That was one of those decisions, those simple little decisions that maybe came out of a penchant for privacy. Maybe I've had one Democrat say to me that, maybe they calculated that taking 3 weeks of bad press on the emails was worth it, as opposed to having Darrell Issa, the head of the Oversight Committee, have every single one of her emails and torture her for years, with them, taking them out of context, et cetera. I don't know if that was the thought process that she went through. There was another problem, which is it took her 2 years after she left the State Department to turn them over. And they only were discovered, the private server was only discovered because of the Benghazi Committee had a subpoena and asked, were there any other emails? So the process is always messy, it looks bad, and I don't have a good explanation for it, because it's not unlike a lot of the other some Democrats would say non-scandal scandals that the Clintons have been involved in.
We have time for one last question on your left.
What role do you think gender is playing in this election?
Gender is playing a huge role, but it's very complicated. It's not, there's no doubt that Donald Trump has used gender like in many different ways. I mean, he's famously got up and said, it's not fair, women have it better than men, we can't say anything without being called sexist, isn't this terrible? And there's tons of gendered comments. On the other hand, this is not an election about a generic woman. This is about a particular woman who has a particular set of attributes and reputation, and people feel certain ways about her. But there's no doubt, as I said before, a woman has to be bionic, women have less margin for error. There have been so many studies done on this. One book that was written says that because women are assumed to be more ethical, that when they do something that's less than ethical, the fall from the pedestal is much steeper, and so the backlash against them is much more. I mean, that's one theory. But look, this is it's a huge part of this election, and she does have one way that gender is playing is that there is a huge gender gap again, and he is on the losing side of it. And that's one of the reasons that he's tried very belatedly to roll out these, programs for family and medical leave.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. You were a great audience.